Hello and welcome to By the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today we continue our series on truth, justice, and leadership with a discussion of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. As we discussed last time, Tocqueville was a French statesman who visited the United States in 1831, and he wrote a massive book called Democracy in America. It comes in two parts. The first half was pretty much about American institutions, history of America and its main institutions. With a lot of philosophical reflections, but focused on government and different layers of government, basically. The second half of the book gets into things like the intellectual life, the moral life, the sentiments of democratic life, just looking at a very holistic picture of how democracy changes the world or doesn't, So Tocqueville is constantly thinking about what's universal in human nature versus what changes in different historical periods. And it finally concludes with a sort of vision of the future of democracy, which he raises some red flags about some potential problems down the road and how to try to prevent them or at least mitigate them. Now, last time we dipped into one aspect from the second half of the book, which was Tocqueville's looking at the influence of democracy on science. And we connected this to Machiavelli in a very simple way because Tocqueville says that in classical thought and culture, the idea of science, knowledge, is looked at as primarily theoretical or contemplative. The primary purpose that we want to know things is to know things because it's good to know them. And the practical results that we can get from knowledge are secondary. Whereas in modern democratic times, he says that's reversed. We may enjoy knowing things to some extent, but we primarily pursue knowledge for the sake of utility. And here's where it gets interesting, and we're going to see this is fairly typical for Tocqueville, that on the one hand, he doesn't protest the modern view so vehemently, reject it completely. He admits, for example, that utility is an actual good that comes from knowledge, and it would be extreme to reject utility. But he insists that it's not the whole picture, that as a matter of fact, there is something natural about desiring knowledge for its own sake, and in fact, something sublime or beautiful about it. So if we miss out on this, we're missing something extremely important by itself. We're missing something that can contribute to our happiness as human beings. And also, he comes around to the conclusion that, in practical terms, it will eventually hurt us if we don't have a desire for knowledge, because science, we simply aren't going to be motivated to do enough scientific research on the right things if we're only aiming at some kind of profits or utilitarian outputs. There have to be at least some people who just want to know things so badly that they'll do anything they can to figure them out. Otherwise, science is going to dry up at some point. So all of that, as we'll see, we get into other sections of Tocqueville, all that is fairly typical of Tocqueville, that he's looking at a modern world which is in many ways very Machiavellian. He understands the Machiavellian premises. He makes them very clear. He rejects them himself, and he says it's not true to human nature. There's more to human nature than what Machiavellian formulas would indicate. But he makes that correction in a very gentle way, not trying to say, hey, let's reject democracy or reject modernity, but rather let's try to supplement it with a broader wisdom and see where we can bring this wisdom to bear within it. So today we're going to look at the way that Tocqueville takes a similar approach to literature within the modern world. And in his book, Tocqueville reflects on a number of different elements of literature and the arts, but this particular chapter we're going to look at is why the study of Greek and Latin literature is particularly useful in democratic societies. So we're going to focus on this because this is where Tocqueville is going to be most explicit about the relationship between classical literature, which he's referring to here as Greek and Latin literature, so ancient Greek and ancient Roman literature, basically. And he's comparing this to contemporary democratic literature. But in particular, he wants to revive or focus on classical literature. It's useful in democratic societies. You notice the little twist there, because the interesting thing is we're going to see, as we have already seen with science, is that utility is the modern measure of things. That's how modern people tend to measure things. How useful are they? So you can guess that in ancient Greek and Latin literature, utility was not really the standard that was emphasized. And yet Tocqueville is going to advocate for an intensive study of classical literature, which is not utilitarian, but he's going to argue for it on the basis of its utility, because his audience, of course, is the modern audience. And he's going to try, it's basically like Machiavelli was suggesting, forget about all those old books, those old ideas, because it's all imaginary, it's not useful. And Tocqueville is going to say, no, don't forget about them, because they actually are useful, right? So he's he's taking a critical stance on on the Machiavellian view, but he's doing it in a very friendly kind of way of saying, hey, you're actually going to miss out on something. You should take a look at it. So the first thing we'll look at here in his analysis is his setting the stage in terms of the structure of a society in times past versus modern times. And this is important in so many different ways. It helps to simply to identify who the audience is for authors. That's one of the main reasons that he mentions this here, but also puts it in the context of the overall common good of society. And Tocqueville, in this book, he makes it clear that he does not believe that there is any political regime that perfectly captures the common good. Like any actual ruling structure is going to have its defects as well as its virtues, and that this is true of the ancient world and the modern world. And here we're going to see an example. He says, what was called the people in the most democratic republics of antiquity. So the most democratic, the most popular governments in the ancient world hardly resembled what we call the people. So in other words, ancient democracy was much less democratic than modern democracy. In Athens, all citizens took part in public affairs, but there were only 20,000 citizens of more than 350,000 inhabitants. All the others were slaves and fulfilled most of the functions that today belong to the people and even to the middle classes. So Tocqueville says it's very deceptive to look at ancient democracy as a predecessor of modern democracy. Why? Because what they meant by democracy is that all 20,000 people are going to participate in politics. But that's 20,000 out of like 400,000 people, right? So in the modern world, by the 1830s, we didn't have universal suffrage, but Tocqueville saw that that was a direction that modern democracy is going. Pretty much every adult, who is a citizen is going to have rights within voting and other political rights, basically. So this is a massive difference in the nature of that society, which includes like who would be the readers, who would be literate, who would be reading things. It's not just a technical issue of teaching literacy, for example, but it also pertains to the regime, who is considered to be an active member of that society who would need to have those skills. So Athens, with its universal suffrage, was, after all, only an aristocratic republic in which all the nobles had an equal right to government. So this is very important to contrast the classical and the modern worlds. Again, in this context of literature, it's particularly important in terms of who are the readership. We would see that a classical author, if you are publishing in the ancient Greek or ancient Rome, then your readership is by definition going to be highly selective, because there are very few people out there who are reading, period. Whereas in the modern world, you certainly could choose to write for a very select audience, but you could also choose to write for a popular audience. That's an option. So that makes a massive difference in terms of how people are going to write, which is what he's going to look at in this chapter. Now, he does bring in some of the technical aspects, that books were rare and expensive in the ancient world. This is long before the printing press. And so this was an additional factor. It wasn't like the entire aristocracy was going to be reading a lot of books. Actually, it was going to be a small elite within the elite who would really focus on having a library and reading things. So it's by far not an industry. It's not treated like an industry, as the way Tocqueville puts it here, which you can already see the contrast that he's preparing for modern times, in which writing is an industry, where publications are cranked out and widely distributed, widely disseminated, and there is at least an aspiration to get something into the hands of just as many people as you can. And such an attitude simply did not exist in the ancient world. He's saying there wasn't the technology or the social context for such a thing. So if you're sitting down to write, you have no designs of trying to reach everybody within that society with what you're writing. So what are the results in this, and why are they important? In this chapter, Tocqueville is going to speak mainly in literary terms, and I want to emphasize again that Tocqueville, as a writer, he presents himself as a commentator on a wide variety of phenomena. And once in a while, he's going to bring, actually mention a philosopher or mention some clearly philosophical theory and bring it in. Most of the time, he's not doing that. So he's just kind of commenting on things, and he's leaving it for us, as he says in the introduction of the book, to actually tie the pieces together a little bit and see what is the philosophical importance of these different observations that he's making. So in this case, we'll want to think about the literary implications of his analysis, but what are the philosophical implications? It is sufficient, in fact, to cast your eyes on the writings that antiquity has left us to discover that if writers there sometimes lacked variety and fertility in subjects. So here he's starting to do the comparison and contrast to modern writing. Modern writers are going to be have more variety, more fertility in subjects. That is, they're going to be covering a lot of different subjects. Boldness, movement, and generalization in thought. Again, these are things that are lacking in antiquity, but would be characteristic of modern writers. Always trying to come up with something new, something flamboyant, making broad generalizations. But getting back to the antiquity, what qualities did they have if they were lacking those modern, qualities? The ancient writers, always demonstrated an admirable art and care in details. Nothing in their work seems done in haste or by chance. Everything is written for connoisseurs, and the search for ideal beauty is shown constantly. Now, if we tie this back to what we looked at before about science, we can already see some important connections here. Tocqueville had said in the ancient world, science was about contemplating the truth. In the modern world, we're more focused on utility, which means that we're less concerned with the details and the nuances because we just want the effectual truth, as Machiavelli would put it. Like, how is it going to work? Is it going to give me what I want? And we see the same thing with literature here. They go together, and literature and science are very much connected because even though we might think of scientists in laboratories and things like that, science is a conceptual thing. It requires conceptual work to even come up with what it is, what the goals, what the methods are, and to reflect on the results. And so there always will be literature involved in science as well as in practically everything else of human consequence. So you could apply this to science and apply this to many different things. And as we saw before, Tocqueville had indicated that there's a higher good there in science, in the contemplation of truth. There's something intrinsically rewarding, intrinsically nourishing, as he puts it. It feeds the human soul. And this is the theme that we're going to see coming up in Tocqueville over and over again. The human soul has needs, he's going to tell us later, and the soul needs to be satisfied. And how is it satisfied? It's satisfied by things like truth, and classical literature has the capacity to satisfy it because there's an admirable art and care in the details. Nothing is done by haste or by chance. That leaves room for contemplation and for probing into the nuances of things. Everything is written for connoisseurs. What's really worth knowing and worth experiencing takes time and effort and energy. If somebody's in a hurry and they're just trying to get the results quickly and move on, then they don't have time for those subtleties, which are the higher, greater goods for the human soul. So just as he had said with science, that it would be harmful in itself if we lost the desire for truth, and ultimately it would dry up science. Tocqueville is also suggesting that it would be intrinsically bad if we lost these qualities of classical writing, the quality of taking your time and delving into detail and nuance and really trying to contemplate and understand the nature of things, rather than being in a big hurry to make a splash and to entertain or to inform. I think it's important to reflect here that the implied superficiality of modern writing could either be in terms of the entertainment value or the information value. Either way, somebody wants certain emotional response out of a book. Somebody wants certain information, but they want it quickly, they want it conveniently, and they want to move on. And so, as contrasted to what he's saying about classical literature, which is that it's for connoisseurs, it's for people who want to go back over and over again and think more and more deeply about something until they can dig deeper and deeper into the nature of things. And so Tocqueville makes a very typical maneuver here, and he says there's no literature that puts more into relief the qualities that are naturally lacking in writers of democracies than that of the ancients. So no literature exists that is more appropriate to study in democratic centuries. This study is, of all, the most appropriate for combating the literary defects inherent in these centuries. As for their natural qualities, they will arise all by themselves and without the need to learn how to acquire them. So just as he had said before, we don't have to worry about the utility of science in the modern world. People will be obsessed with the utility of science. We're not going to have to encourage them to find useful things. What we need to do is encourage people to contemplate truth, because that's what they're going to forget in the modern world. And he does the same thing here with literature. He said we don't need to encourage people to write on a variety of topics, to write with boldness, and to try to do something new and exciting. That's going to be the tendency in modern times. Everything is going to be like that. What we need to do is to try to encourage people to actually take their time and write carefully and with precision. So I want to make a couple comments about that. One is what Tocqueville is trying to exhibit here is very important in terms of leadership, which he's trying to be a good friend. He's not saying to the modern world, modernity is so horrible, just, we might as well just pull the plug and because this is so bad. No, he wants to actually encourage, like what he had said before about, well, most people were slaves in the ancient world. That's very significant. The ancient world may have had many beautiful, sublime things in it, but the vast majority of people were slaves. So he always wants us to keep it in mind that there are many wonderful things about modern democracy, as he calls it. For example, the vast majority of people are free to pursue happiness. So that's huge. But on the other hand, he wants to be a good friend, not a flatterer. He doesn't want to say, "Oh, everything's fine, everything's wonderful. Just keep doing what you're doing. You be you, whatever." That's a way of leading somebody into mediocrity, if not worse, right? So as a good friend, Tocqueville wants to say, yeah, it's nice that you have some of these wonderful things. What about what you're lacking? And things that actually are fundamental to human nature and human happiness that you're neglecting, and in the long run is going to make you unhappy. What about those things? Can you find room for that? Can you learn a little bit about that and see where that could fit into your existence? So that's what he's doing throughout the book, and he's doing that here. Another thing I want to mention about this is, how does it apply to Tocqueville himself? Tocqueville is writing in the modern world, but he says that we really need to imitate the classical authors. So I would say if you look at his book, Democracy in America, it's a very interesting mix of the classical and modern elements. So on the one hand, as noted, it's sort of a commentary, written in French for a French audience, a commentary on America. So it's a novelty kind of a book. Most of the French at the time didn't really know a lot about America. And he goes and he does this in-depth study. The length of the book is probably pushing against the tendencies of modern society and culture. But at that time, in early modernity, I think there were still more people who were willing to read long books. But in any case, Tocqueville is writing something that has a certain, popular appeal to it. At least the first half of the book did. The second half of the book that we're looking at now actually didn't have as much popularity because it was more philosophical, and a lot of people didn't get what the point of it was. So Tocqueville, as he's presenting this, which in some ways is suited for a modern audience, informing them about new and novel things that they don't know about, which is a popular genre in modern times. But at the same time, Tocqueville, he took a lot of time to write this book. He took years, for each half of it. And he was being extremely careful and meticulous about how he presented. If you look at a critical edition of the book, you can see his notes and drafts, and you can see how much he revised and how much he was really trying to whittle this down to the most penetrating thoughts that he could come up with into the phenomena that he was covering. So he is trying to imitate the classics in the way that he writes, even while he's packaging it in a way that is going to be marketable in the modern world. So he's utilizing his own insights here, but he's also trying to offer them to others to say that this is what if you want to accomplish something really great and good in the modern world, this is the kind of thing you should be thinking about, is to understand the tendencies of modernity and to have some patience and sympathy with them, but not to be hogtied to them, that you can't think outside of that box and think in terms of greater, more beautiful, more sublime truths and goods that are available. Now, the final part I want to look at here is what is Tocqueville's specific recommendation. And first of all, he says, it is clear that in democratic societies, the interest of individuals, as well as the security of the state, requires that the education of the greatest number be scientific, commercial, and industrial, rather than literary. So he admits here that we're not going to take modern, literature habits for granted to the point where we're just going to teach classical literature and let people figure out the modern stuff on their own. In fact, he's not really calling for universal teaching of Greek and Latin literature. And this is one of the places where I think it would be interesting to debate Tocqueville a little bit. What is the value of a very broad, but for most people, of course, it's going to be a relatively superficial encounter or understanding with the classics. But his call here is, he says, Greek and Latin must not be taught in all schools, but it is important that those destined by their nature or their fortune to cultivate letters or predisposed to appreciate them find schools where they can perfectly master ancient literature and be thoroughly penetrated by its spirit. So on the negative side, Tocqueville is not really interested in universal classical education. And again, without getting into that debate too much, what is his basic reasoning? His basic reasoning, where he talks about the security of the state, the interest of individuals, is that in a modern democratic society, people have to make a living, and they're going to need practical skills. Also, in a modern democratic society, people are not born into any particular skill or trade. We're all free to do anything that we want, but for that very reason, when we're 5 or 10, we don't necessarily know what we're going to be doing when we're 20 or 30. So it takes a lot of our time and energy to figure that out. That's something in the classical world was not the case. Most people were going to do what they were born into. So when they were 4 years old, they already knew what they were going to do when they were 40. So they had their entire childhood to learn their trade. They didn't have any freedom to choose something else, but they had all the time in the world to master it. And in modern society, it's the other way around. We have all the freedom, but we don't have the time because it takes that time to figure out what we're going to do with our freedom. So for reasons like that, he's saying, we don't need to focus on this for everybody. But what he does look at is in terms of leadership of society. Who is going to be writing and who is going to be, reading as like a connoisseur, as he put it earlier, who's really going to be into reading in a serious way. There will be a subclass of people like that. And these people are going to, of course, have a big influence on the rest of everybody in society. They're going to be generating a lot of the ideas that will eventually become popular in various ways. And so that is his concern here in this chapter. He wants to make sure that such people would not only dabble in classics, but they would become perfect masters of ancient literature. So he's not, in this chapter, he's not looking at the content of that. He's not saying, well, what are you going to learn specifically from ancient literature? But we could already see, connecting it back to the science section, that this is one of the things that you can learn from, is how to pursue truth for its own sake. That is a major theme in classical literature. If you're a perfect master of classical literature, you're going to be deeply educated about the pursuit of truth. So that's one thing we can already see here. And as we go forward in this course, we're going to see some further things that Tocqueville would associate with classical literature, which indirectly are coming through in this passage here, where he says that the intellectual leaders of democratic society should be steeped in the classics. They should have a thorough understanding of the classics, and therefore these other ideas that he will connect to classical thought in his book.